After the funeral, I loaded up my beat-up Skoda Fabia with art supplies and drove to the cabin. I've never really enjoyed portrait painting. Creating art with the express goal of soothing someone's ego wasn't my cup of tea, but it paid. Painting portraits paid, and it had been a very expensive year. My agent was beside himself, and I phoned to inform him that I was coming back to doing commissions. It had been a year since I had painted anything, professionally or privately. He celebrated my return to the profession and bemoaned how it took 3 painters to cover my usual workload. His tone changed when I signed up for 24 portraits over the course of 3 months.
Daniel, I'm more than happy to give you the work, but you sure you can handle it?
Yes.
Are you going to be at your cabin the whole time? It might be difficult to ship the portraits if...
There's a post office a 30-minute drive from the cabin. I'm taking a van. I'll leave the paintings to dry in the shed and deliver them in bulk. I can manage.
Okay, well, I'll send the reference photographs to your email.
Good.
Are you sure you're going to be able to do the work?
Yes.
Well, alright then. You're the artist. My condolences, by the way. You two seem to be happy together. I'm sure she's in a happier place now.
Thanks. There were 4 days of heavy rainfall prior to my arrival. Usually I would park the car next to their house, crossing the bridge my father and me helped build when I was young. The heavy rain, however, had turned the calm stream next to the cabin muddy and wild. Driving the van over the old wooden bridge seemed like a dangerous financial decision. Instead, I carried my supplies over the creaking wood by hand and left the car parked by the side of the road. The inside of the cabin smelled like rot. Down in the kitchen, there were 3 finely picked skeletal remains of mice. Upstairs, right by our bed, there was another dead mouse, but its corpse was untouched, just bloated from the poison and a couple months of death. The sight wasn't pretty, but it was nice to know that whatever was eating dead mice in the kitchen couldn't crawl up the stairs. We hadn't visited the cabin since the summer of yesteryear, and it showed. The wooden walls were crooked from the insulation being eaten up, the porcelain around the toilet bowl had been cracked from an unchecked winter freeze, and the faucet in the kitchen only sprayed boiling hot water. The one from the upstairs bathroom only allowed for water slightly above freezing point. One of the stairs to the bedroom was, as usual, dangerously wobbly. I made vague plans to fix everything broken in the cabin somewhere down the line. Outside of the cabin, in the spot where our flower garden once stood, there was a mess of weeds and grass. The overgrown patch of land surrounded by a failing fence didn't seem out of place. Seeing the garden in that state, however, was significantly more discomforting than the appearance of the cabin. I collected the dead mice and threw them in the raging water below. Then I set to pruning the garden. I'm good with a paintbrush, but horribly clumsy with everything else. For the first rain-soaked 20 minutes, it felt like I was desecrating a grave. Yet soon enough, I found my footing. By the time I reached the edge of the plot, I even found myself enjoying the mechanical nature of pulling out weeds. For a while, I thought about nothing. For dinner, I ate oversalted eggs. I took my meal outside on the veranda, hoping that I could get through some work. The bag full of reference photographs sat on my lap for the entirety of the meal. I didn't even attempt opening it. The creaking of the old wooden roof made me uncomfortable, and the state of the eggs made me not want to work. Instead, I decided to drink. Down in the basement, I found a bottle of wine we had been saving for an anniversary or a guest we wanted to impress. I also found 3 more dead mice. It smelled like there were more in the walls. The cruel thing about rat poison, my father used to say, is that when there's enough of it, the mice store it for the winter. I left the corpses alone for the time being and retreated with my wine. As I drank, I dusted off my father's record player from the 70s. I sincerely doubted the bulky machine would work, and I was, in part, correct. I thought Coltrane's favorite things would lift my spirits. The record player played the peppy tune at quarter speed. It sounded less like the carefree stroll of a majestic bird and more like the dying yelps of a choked goose. After a couple of minutes of strained notes and static, the record player breathed its last. It also knocked out all of the electricity in the cabin in the process. I wanted to go check the breakers, but I was too drunk to get up. It's not like I tried too hard. I was tired. Half-hearted promises of doing work in the morning slid through my mind among other thoughts. I drank in the abyss, watching the black forest beyond. At times my heart quickened at the thought of being lost in those woods, stuck in the darkness, surrounded by wild animals. Yet those terrors were temporary. Most of the time, I just felt small. I felt like I was a small part of something huge and cruel and incomprehensible. Past the shivering of the trees, I could hear a desperate howl. It dragged on into the night, shivering and strained. It got no reply. The wolf howled again. I imagined a man leaning out of a hospital window and howling out into the lampless streets. I wondered if he'd hear an echo. I wondered if anyone would respond. The wolf howled long into the night, weakening with each plea. I wondered whether it had any kin that would look out for it, whether it was just a lost part of a pack, or whether it was cursed to be alone. I fell asleep to memories of us discussing children back when they were an option. The next morning I woke with a terrible hangover and a fire in my bladder. Finding the climb to the second-floor bathroom impossible, I relieved myself in the grass outside. My poisoned stomach and scorched brain blocked out most of the relief, but before I was done, another sensation scratched across my mind. A flash of light, a burst of energy, a calling. I was shaking, clawing at the inside of my hands. Each step I took to the easel felt like a slow, unsecured fall. I had not done any real drawing since her diagnosis. There were a few naughty sketches that I drew to cheer her up, but I had long burnt those. I had not done any real drawing since her diagnosis, but that morning I had no choice. Something within me demanded, craved for me to touch the canvas. Letting go of anything recognizable, I painted. Years ago, back when I was known as a quick, reliable worker, I would spend at least an hour or two sketching on paper, feeling out the tenor of the painting I was to make. That's what made me quick. I didn't waste any time fixing mistakes. I knew exactly what I was going to draw before I held the brush in my hand. Yet that morning, there were no sketches. That morning, I layered the paint without any knowledge of what was hiding within the canvas. Some foreign force instructed my hands in a language my head couldn't understand. Outside, a thunderstorm raged. Yet the only thing I could hear was the soft shiver of the trees and that desperate howl. The moment I stepped away from the painting, my stomach reminded me it existed and that I had mistreated it. Looking at the painting made me dizzyingly nauseous. I went out into the rain once more. The sun had almost set by then. My whole day was spent in front of a canvas and I remembered none of it. It was unlike anything I had painted before. I'd never been one for hyperrealism. Showing things as they are rarely suits a portrait painter. Even in my private drawings, I would skew towards impressions rather than stark images of reality. The painting that stood before me resembled none of my earlier work. Black and white and grey, a family portrait of a suffering family. The three of them stood in front of a broken-down barn. The mother and father wore the tattered clothes of peasants. They both looked to be on the edge of starvation and sick with some sort of fever. The teenage son in the middle looked to be in better shape, but his face skewed away from that of a human. His eyes were too far apart. His skull was misshapen. The boy had a completely vacant look in his face. With their sunken eyes, his parents stared back at me as if I was to blame. I wanted to take the painting to the shed so I wouldn't have to look at it, but the rain was still too strong to transport it. So, instead, I went to dispose of the dead mice from the basement. The moment I threw them in the muddy water, my phone rang. It was my agent. He was checking up on me. It didn't take long for him to ask about progress.
I haven't had a chance to go through the reference photographs yet. I did some painting today, though.
A split-second look at the canvas was all that I could manage. The specks of dirt on their faces were far too real.
I think I need to get something out of me. I'll take a look at the photographs over dinner and choose a place to start. Okay, Daniel. Take your time.
He said in a tone that suggested I should immediately get to work.
If you're looking for a place to start, the Novakovets family portrait would be great. Miss Novakova is a fussy client, but she pays well. Okay.
I didn't manage to cook anything that evening. I was far too spent from the painting and my stomach couldn't handle much anyway. I ate a banana while looking through the reference photographs. It was a long, absent-minded meal. Without thinking about it, I had divided up the photographs into two stacks. Family portraits and everything else. I knew I wouldn't be getting to Miss Novakova's commission anytime soon. The sun set as I listed through the photographs of insecure middle management. Soon enough, their pudgy faces became difficult to see. The breakers were still off, and I had no interest in going back to the basement. Instead, I sat on the veranda, watching the sunset. The storm had passed. There was still a bit of light coming from behind the dark green hills, but most of the sky had turned the color of royal silk. I wanted to enjoy the majesty of nature, to lose myself in the shadow of something greater, but I couldn't. From the corner of my eye, I could see the painting. Even in the dimness of the coming night, I could see the outlines of the 3 miserable characters. They were looking at me. At some point, I was even certain they were shifting around, trying to get closer to me. The tortured eyes of the 2 peasants stayed locked on me, as if pleading for their creator to better their station in life. But soon enough the darkness blotted them out once more. I was left alone with the night. The manic mess of stars was unlike anything I would ever see in the city. Somewhere out there, beyond the ancient explosions of light, there was darkness. Far from my broken down cottage in microscopic form, there was an inconceivable abyss. Something in that abyss stirred. I dreamt I walked through a forest, a cold, sunless wood. All was silent with the exception of the swaying trees. I had no destination, and there was no path. I just walked through a forest of towering trees for what felt like an eternity. I walked aimlessly through the mud and twigs until it started to rain. The storm was sudden. I started looking for a place to hide from the hail. Right before me, there was a tree with a thick trunk and heavy leaves. I approached it for shelter. A deafening crack, a stream of raw energy from the stormy heavens. My transition to the waking world was seamless. One moment I was running through the hail, and the next I was standing in my veranda. With very little input from my conscious body, I started mixing paint. Like a corpse controlled by a merciless force, I forced life onto the canvas. I did so thoughtlessly. My hands moved without the slightest input of my mind. The picture rolled out on the canvas from the depths of my soul, but it was being pulled by a foreign power. When I finished the painting, I wanted to look away. I wanted to look away and distance myself from the easel, but I forced my eyes to gaze back at what I had created. Black and white and grey. A scene from a deathbed. A frail peasant sitting by his wife's side. He holds her hand, but he looks out at the audience with an expression of stifled torture. The wife's face is hidden from the darkness, but a solitary lamplight sits by her bed of straw. In the ever so gentle light, her condition becomes apparent. She is long dead. There are maggots in her eyes. The longer I looked at the painting, the more certain I was that I could see the maggots shift from side to side. Fearing for my sanity, I grabbed both the horrid paintings and left them in the shed. We never put any rat poison in the shed. I had no certainty that the paintings would get chewed up by mice. Yet I did not linger for a moment. I shut the shed door as soon as I could and went back to the cabin. I felt ill. The breakers on the electricity were a foreign concept to me, but I somehow got them to work. The electric kettle in the kitchen sounded like an impending bomb, but it still managed to boil some water. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, sipping on hot tea, trying to understand why I had drawn those 2 horrible paintings. The day she died was prefaced by 100 days where she slowly slipped away. By the time she couldn't recognize me, I felt like I had spent every tear I had. I thought I was done mourning. I thought I was ready to carry on. I thought I got all of my grief out. The cruel thing about rat poison is that if there's enough of it, the mice will store it for the winter. With no energy to cook, I ate a meal of bread and ham. The food was tasteless, but my stomach was empty enough to be painful. All I needed was some nutrition, a shower, and a solid 12 hours of sleep in a bed. Once I got some rest, I would be okay. Or so I thought. I hallucinated on the stairs. Just as I lay foot on the one wobbly step that has always been unstable, I heard humming. Someone was humming out by the flower garden. I was certain of it. I recognized the voice. Yet when I ran outside, she was not there. I forcefully dragged the thought out of my mind and told myself to go take a shower and sleep. Halfway through the staircase to my bedroom, however, I found myself stuck at the same faulty stair. I kept one foot on the stair, occasionally shifting my weight. A part of me was regurgitating all the time she asked me to fix the wobbly step, but most of my energy was focused on listening. I wanted to hear her voice again. I needed to hear her voice again. Yet nothing came. All I could hear was the howling of the wind outside. For a couple of minutes I stood there like a madman, stuck on a broken stair, trying to recapture something that never existed to begin with. Then my phone rang. My agent. I dropped the call and went to the shower. The pressure on the nozzle was weaker than the faucet. The shower felt less like a cleansing experience and more like standing beneath a rain gutter, but at least I smelled clean by the end of it. When I laid my head on the pillow, the sun was still in the sky. After a couple blinks, it had set. It was a long night that passed through short feverish snippets. The lack of a fire in the furnace was palpable. The cabin was shuddering under the strength of the outside wind, yet I was sweating. Hunger and thirst and pain were brewing inside of me, but I had no energy to do anything about them. All I could do was lay in bed and think. I thought about ghosts. I thought about whether a part of her could remain tied to the garden even after the life support machines went dim. I thought about whether my father's spirit didn't flicker into existence whenever I put on a Davis record. By the time the sun started to shine in through the window, I had decided that ghost stories are just another lie the bereaved tell themselves. My mind still felt diminished, but even with a mental fog clouding all of my movement, I managed to dress myself and cook eggs. I ate on the veranda, hoping that some fresh air and work would do me good. Sorting through the reference photographs was a completely soulless experience. By the time I randomly picked out a picture of a stern-looking man in a suit, my hands were completely numb. I kept on hoping that another rush of inspiration would hit me, but it didn't. Instead, I found myself etching vague shapes in my sketchbook. For hours, I sat on the veranda, trying to will myself into picking up the brush, but I couldn't. My mind kept on drifting over to the tortured paintings in a shed. I was able to draw eyes that gazed into the soul one day, and unable to do a rough sketch the next. For hours I sat on the veranda, stuck in a pit of self-loathing and confusion. My ringtone snapped me back to reality. He didn't mention me ducking his previous call, but it was apparent in his tone. My agent was nervous about me delivering the portraits I signed up for. When I told him I had spent the previous day working on another personal piece, he let out a long sigh.
What do you plan to do with these paintings?
What do you mean?
Are you trying to sell them, or are you just planning to decorate the house?
I don't want them here. The words left my mouth before I had the thought. The idea of the discomforting paintings not being on the property eased my mind. Maybe that's what I needed to relax.
Think anyone would buy them? Send some pictures.
Walking to the shed, I found myself secretly hoping for rat infestation. I knew I had bills to pay, and I knew that my agent's patience was wearing thin, but I wanted to see those horrid eyes ripped apart by rats. They were not. Whole and mostly dry, the paintings rested against the walls of the shed. I did my best not to look too closely at the paintings as I photographed them, but I was starting to grow certain that the characters had once again shifted. The grieving family was standing closer together. The widower was no longer holding his wife's skeletal hand. The painting seemed just the slightest bit unfamiliar to me, yet the horrid gazes remained.
Huh. Okay.
There was a long silence.
Yeah, alright. I can see if this gets any bites. Just for God's sake, Daniel, put those things up on a shelf or something. The shed does not look safe.
Okay, I'll do that right now. I was already back on the veranda by then, but I added moving the paintings off the floor to my to-do list.
Okay.
He sighed again, with slightly less desperation this time.
Alright, I can figure something out with those two. Meanwhile, I need you to get back to work on the projects we agreed upon. Novakova is a priority. She sent in another note, something about making her daughter's skirt longer. Anything below the knee should be kosher.
Okay.
Good. Please be available on the phone tomorrow.
Okay. I made myself another cup of warm tea and settled down by the reference photographs. I dug around the undesirable pile until I found the Novakovits family. A heavy-set woman with a perplexing bowl cut and a skeletal husband in the center. A son with frizzy hair flanked the father, and a daughter with a skirt I found perfectly acceptable stood next to the mother. For a moment I wondered what kind of a father I would have been if we had a daughter. Then I put away the photograph and brought out the stern-looking man in the suit. His face was ever so gently misshapen, like those of the Habsburgs, yet his lack of smile would make the painting significantly easier. His strange eyebrows were twisted into a scowl. The customer didn't want a friendly portrait. He wanted to be feared. Anger is easier to replicate on the canvas than joy. The audience can tell a bad smile from a mile away. I decided I would knock out the simple portrait first, before moving on to the intricacies of the Novakovitz family. A jolt of energy made me confident that I would get a good chunk of work done before sunset. To make my working conditions a bit more stimulating, I even messed around with the record player. The amount of dust gathered around the spinning mechanism was absurd. I put on Davis's Water Babies and hoped for the best. The result was a scratchy vinyl, played at around normal speed. That was the closest victory I got that day. My hands went numb the moment they seized the pencil. I couldn't manage a single sketch. I lowered my expectations from a chunk of work to a single croquis drawing, something quick and dirty just to get the shape of the man's face under my hands. Anything to convince me I haven't wasted a full day. Yet I didn't draw a single line. The record player started to skip. Soon enough, the silences became more pronounced than the music. I kept on bargaining with myself to draw at least a single line, to make the tiniest bit of progress before the sun set. But I didn't. I sat on the veranda, unable to lift a muscle, watching the night seize everything around me. The sudden burst of wild jazz went quiet. I was left alone with the howling wind and the calm terror of the countryside. My heart quickened whenever I thought of the dark woods beyond, but my mind refused to think of anything else. A part of me enjoyed the fear. A part of me found comfort in the helplessness. Just as I started to drift off, I could feel my hands moving across the paper. It was far too dark for me to see what they were doing. That rush of energy was back. It was as if the darkness of the hills had somehow permeated through my skin and wrestled the reins of my soul away from me. I woke standing, moving towards the canvas. My hands reached for more color that morning. Along with the black and white flesh of my subjects, there was mud and blood. I let myself paint, recognizing the face which I was bringing to the canvas. A couple chance glances at the reference photograph made the character clear. I was painting the strange-faced manager with a stern expression. Yet on the canvas, his crisp suit was replaced with tattered robes. The man's clothes had been ripped and soaked in blood from his wounds. His stern expression was gone as well. The man was strung up on roughly constructed gallows. Round the dead man, furious peasants gathered with raised knives and fists. Off in a corner of the painting, a group of rats waited for a meal. They were looking straight at me. The rush of inspiration made me feel less impotent, but its creation made me miserable. It felt as if I had brought something horrible to this world, as if I had committed some sort of primal sin with the strokes of my brush. I went upstairs under the guise of taking a shower, but I stopped at the wobbly stair. I knew she was dead. I knew ghosts don't exist. Yet I still stood on that stair, trying to recapture something that was gone. I didn't hear any humming. Instead, my phone rang. I didn't pick up, but the moment the call went to voicemail, the phone started to ring again. I couldn't avoid him. I would have to tell my agent that the only thing I was able to paint were scenes of suffering and horror. My heart sank at the thought of severing my one tie to the outside world, but I knew I had to tell him I couldn't paint any more portraits. The third time he called, I picked up. His tone was different than I expected.
Mr. Havlik, I'm phoning to inform you that you're about to become a very wealthy man. I found a buyer for your paintings, both of them. He says he's very interested in your art and insisted that we call him first if you produce any more pieces with a similar feel. I would suggest you to produce more pieces with a similar feel.
Then he told me the sum offered. It was significantly more than I had ever made off of a single painting.
Daniel,
he said, his voice growing cold from my lack of response.
It's good money, Daniel. You'd be a fool not to take the deal. Okay. Good. I've already arranged for someone to pick up the paintings tomorrow. No need to wrap them, the transport will take care of that. Rest up and get ready for more work. There's plenty of money to be made here. What about the portraits? Screw the portraits. If you have more of this art inside of you, let it out. I'll happily take care of everything else.
I asked for the price again. He repeated it, I said okay again, and then hung up. The gentlest gust of meaning blew through the veranda. She always talked about fixing the cabin up, but there wasn't much I could do on a pauper salary. She understood, and never tried to change me. Yet, she always talked about fixing up the cabin. I thought about ghosts again. I still didn't believe in them, but I figured that if they did exist, fixing up the cabin was a good idea. There wasn't much else I would be spending the money on anyway. I had plenty of time to paint. That night, and for many nights afterwards, I sat on the veranda and awaited the darkness. It's because of those skin-crawling embraces with the abyss that I was able to keep up my painting. The unforgiving countryside would infect me with images of suffering and famine, and each morning I would transpose those visions onto the canvas. Each day, the lifelike scenes grew more graphic. The children were more malformed, the bones of the peasants were more pronounced, cannibalism was starting to become more prevalent in the work. More color flowed into the paintings. The bruises and boils on the faces of the peasants looked like they could be touched. The paintings grew in their unearthly quality each day, yet one thing never changed. The eyes of the suffering subjects always looked straight at me. I was the cause of their pain. I was the reason why they had to act out those horrid scenes. Painting the visions made me physically ill. Every day I averted my eyes from the finished products, feeling like I had committed some carnal sin. Even after I locked the paintings away in the shed, the guilt stayed with me. But in return, I got to watch the cabin blossom. My first paycheck went to getting the mice corpses out of the walls and getting my father's record player fixed. The machine required an antique specialist, and it would have been significantly cheaper to have simply bought a new player, but my agent took care of the details. Once it became apparent that my output wasn't slowing down, he had taken on a caretaker role. He handled all the reconstructions being managed on the cabin so that I could wholly focus on painting. The couple times that I did glance at the invoices he was sending me, the numbers didn't properly add up, but the solitude of not having to deal with contractors made up for whatever commission he was taking. I just wanted to see the cabin get fixed up. I just wanted to believe that she was watching me. And some days I did believe it. On some days I felt like even though I was doing something that made me feel filthy and drained, it had a higher calling. On most days, however, I felt completely numb. But I kept working, hoping that those small glimpses of meaning weren't far off. Yet the more I painted, the more horrid scenes I brought to life, the less I felt like there was any goodness in my work. My agent, fearing that I wanted to cut him out of the transaction, was vague about where my paintings were going, and the more I thought about the price and nature of the exchange, the less I wanted to know about it. By the time winter came, my days had simmered down to nothing but painting and keeping myself from starving. Central heating had been installed in the cabin, yet I still slept on the veranda. The landscape of the dark woods was covered in hordes of snow, yet it remained still as oppressive as it was before. I knew that without those dark nights, my ability to paint those nightmarish vistas would disappear. Each morning, I woke feeling like I had slept outside in a snowstorm, but the chills and exhaustion only set in after my day's work was done. By then, I no longer needed energy. By then, I would go lie down in my heated bedroom and wait for the night to come once more. Around mid-December, I turned off my phone and instructed my agent not to send anyone to the cabin for a month. The occasional delivery boy or repairman always made me uncomfortable, but there was another reason why I wanted to completely sever myself from the world. January 4th was her birthday. I wanted the day to pass without thinking about it. I knew I didn't have the mental fortitude to think about it. All of my date-carrying electronics were off. I had long stopped counting the passage of time, yet one night, as I stared out into the snow-covered forest, I heard the unmistakable sound of fireworks from the valley beyond. It was New Year's Eve. I did my best to forget, to trick my mind into not counting days, but I couldn't. Against my will, the nights tallied in the back of my head. The third night after fireworks, I did not sleep at all. The night was as dark as it always was. The air stung my lungs the same way it had for weeks. Yet I couldn't sleep this time. Instead of letting in the darkness of the outside world, my mind caved in on itself. All I could think about was her. A mess of memories, the good, the bad, the painful, the pleasurable. My thoughts were a maelstrom of emotions all tied to her. The rest of the world faded away beneath the pure injustice of her passing. I had no way of telling time. Both my phone and my watch were locked in a drawer upstairs, yet in my bones I felt the passing of midnight. It was her birthday. I didn't know how to deal with that fact. For months I had let her memory be covered up by the unyielding blackness of the wilderness, but that night her spirit burned far too bright. Hoping that unconsciousness would come easier in a warm bed, I went inside. On my way to the bedroom, however, I stopped. The cabin had transformed since the money came in. After a couple of months, it looked less like a broken-down shelter and more like a vacation home. Everything was rebuilt from the ground up, or at least given a new coat of paint, with the exception of the stairs. The stairs were connected to one of the structural beams of the cottage, and replacing them would put the whole structure at risk. At least that's what my agent said the contractor told him. That night, I didn't care about structural integrity. I was just happy to feel a familiar wobble beneath my feet. I sat down on a faulty stair, and like a malnourished bearded infant, I rocked myself back and forth on the wood as if it were a crib. Through regression and desperation, I found my mind calming. The more my mind calmed, the more I could hear her. She was humming outside, working away at the flower garden. It was the middle of the night, and snow had covered everything outside. I knew there was no way my dead wife could be doing gardening work, yet I was certain I could hear her. The melody of her voice brought me comfort. It brought me clarity. She would have loved the way the cabin looked. My father would have been proud, but neither of them would be happy to see me in my current state. I was a broken man, rocking back and forth on a worn wooden stair. For months I had made my money by reaching deep into the bottomless pit of grief at my core and bringing it to life. The creaky wooden cabin had transformed into something impressive, yet it did so at the cost of my sanity. If they could see me, neither of them would have cared about the state of the cottage. They would have cared about me. I listened to her humming, desperately trying to transport myself back to a happier time, but soon another sound broke in through the quiet night. On the back of the howling wind, faint at first, but unavoidable as time marched on, I could hear pained wails. I wasn't sure whether the cries were in a language I could not comprehend, or whether they were simply pure vocal expressions of suffering, but the more I listened to them, the more distant her humming became. The wails were coming from the shed. Hoping that a closer observation would make the auditory hallucinations disappear, I got off the wobbly stair and walked outside. The sounds of suffering didn't fade away like my wife's humming did. The closer I moved to the shed, the louder they got. By the time I was standing by the shed, I was no longer sure they were a byproduct of my imagination. Opening the door wiped away all doubts. There were about a dozen paintings in the shed, and from each, without question, cries of pain and suffering flowed. Even in the dark, I could see that there was something unearthly about the paintings. In the faint moonlight, the canvases shifted under a shuddering strain. The paintings were grasping for the outside world. Every muscle in my body wanted to turn around and head back to the wobbly stair, but I forced myself to turn on the light. I forced myself to come face to face with my creations. I never had any illusions about the paintings being a normal product of my imagination. I always had a suspicion that there was something more at play, that they had a life of their own. Yet I long ago buried those thoughts under the excuse of my diminished mental state. I convinced myself that the paintings weren't really moving, that the expression in the eyes of my tortured subjects was just good technique. For months I convinced myself that the paintings were simply a byproduct of my mourning. Looking out at the canvases in the shed, I knew the truth was much worse. The cruel thing about rat poison is if there is enough of it, you might store it for the winter. The subjects of the paintings, the misshapen children, the starving peasants, the fevered masses, they were alive. They were alive and suffering, and I was responsible for it all. They were begging for death. With a good helping of pain thinner and a lighter, I released them from their suffering. I set flames to the shed without much thought, but the experience was wholly different from my dark painting sessions. I lit the shed on fire knowing that I was doing the right thing. My mind was blank purely because I refused to let any doubt slither into my internal monologue. I didn't want to think about my agent, or the amount of money that I was burning. I just wanted to stop the suffering that I had brought into the world, and do whatever was in my power to push my moral qualms aside. In doing so, I also pushed aside the thoughts of fire safety. The first couple of minutes of the fire were quiet, Peaceful even. The crackling of the flame drowned out all of the wails. Watching the smoke coming out of the shed and the occasional flame peek out of the wood filled me with a feeling of calmness I had not felt in a long time. But then, something changed. It sounded like a sigh of relief, as if a suffering crowd was given a respite. It sounded like a sigh of relief, but the sigh was followed by a calamity. One moment, the fire in the shed was a controlled burn behind closed doors. And then, the blast pushed me down into the snow. By the time I managed to get on my feet, the roof of the veranda was on fire. By the time I managed to contact the fire department, the whole cabin was burning bright. It was well past midnight, and the nearest help was an hour away. When the fire truck finally managed to crawl through the valley, there was nothing left worth saving. Months of work and decades worth of memories were undone in under an hour. The charred husk of the family cabin hurts to see, but knowing that I had paid penance for bringing those cursed forms to life gives me some amount of respite. Yet I know I've brought more suffering to this world than the dozen paintings I have destroyed. I know my unearthly sins have not been forgiven. I know there are still starving peasants suffering because of me. If you see any of my paintings, don't think. Just burn them.